There has been lots of discussion around the prospect of a new targeted tax specifically for electric vehicles being announced shortly in this year's budget within the UK. It centres around the feeling that the government might seek to introduce an additional tax above the existing vehicle excise duty, formerly known as road tax, which was, until this year, free for electric vehicles. I have some opinions on this which I'm happy to share, but first let's examine some of the facts which bring some perspective on why something like this might even be on the table, what it means for current and prospective EV drivers, and the transition to electric vehicles in general. There has been many reports and widespread discussion about the prospect of a new tax targeted specifically for electric vehicle drivers. The Telegraph originally broke the story, with info leaked to them via a government source. The feeling is this could be announced as soon as the budget on the 26th of November. The information suggests that electric vehicle drivers might be hit with an additional rate of tax charged on a per mile basis. 3p is currently being touted as a possible starting point. Having reintroduced a grant for selected electric vehicles earlier this year, such a policy would seem directly contradictory to the existing stance of supporting widespread EV adoption. So let's begin by exploring why such a change of direction could actually be on the cards. Looking at the existing taxation structure for petrol, we have an average retail cost to the customer of £1.34 per litre. It does vary depending on whether you're on a motorway and whereabouts in the country you are, and so on, but that's roughly what you expect to pay. Now, regardless of where you are in the country, the fuel duty makes up 52.95 of that. And then, on top of that, another 20% of tax is added for VAT, meaning the total taxes on petrol is actually more than the cost of the fuel itself. It's a very similar story for diesel. It's a slightly higher average price at £1.43 per litre, but the same 52.95 of that is made up of fuel duty, and then of course another 20% tax for the VAT. As such, here in the UK, where internal combustion engine cars are concerned, we have very expensive travel costs. These tax rates have remained stable for several years, but reviewing the revenue collected from fuel duty, it tells a different story. Income from fuel duty specifically has been steadily declining as EV adoption becomes more popular. The year of 2020 to 2021 is the only real outlier for the trend due to the COVID disruption. So as EV adoption accelerates, this could pose an increased threat to this particular tax stream. That's not to say that EV drivers aren't contributing to the total tax bill, however. The purchase of a new EV is subject to the same 20% VAT as a petrol or diesel car, except with the purchase cost being that little bit higher, there's a little bit of extra revenue there. The purchase of a home EV charger is also subject to 20% VAT, although you can get that reduced to 5% if it's part of a solar install at the same time. If you're charging from home, that fuel, all the energy there, that's subject to 5% VAT. If you're charging in public, that's subject to 20% VAT. There's also vehicle excise duty, formerly known as road tax, that's £195 a year, and there might be additional supplements if the car is valued at more than £40,000. But there is clearly a concern that the combined total of all the above may not add up to the same amount that is being lost from fuel duty. We are talking billions here, as a result of the popular adoption of electric vehicles. At a time when finances are tight, it's understandable people might look in different directions for new revenue streams. Let's take a look at the current cost of fuel for electric vehicle users, which includes myself, by the way. The best case scenario is charging from home 100% of the time and always using the cheap off-peak time frame for the best rate. For me, I'm on Octopus Intelligent Go. That's 7p per kilowatt hour. Assuming an efficiency around the year of 3.5 miles per kilowatt hour, that can result in a fuel cost of just 2p per mile. It's a very reasonable rate that gives a great sense of freedom to travel. Let's explore the impact of a 3p per mile tax hike in this particular scenario. That means that 2p per mile currently being enjoyed by a number of electric vehicle drivers goes up to 5p per mile. That's an effective taxation rate of around 150%, and that's before you even consider that 5% of the existing 2p is VAT. Proportionally, such an increase has a massive effect to travel costs. Thinking about it, I can only really think of a couple of items that have higher effective taxation rates. One is cigarettes and the other is alcohol, but that makes sense given the apparent health risks. What about those using public chargers? A key issue facing prospective EV drivers and a huge barrier to widespread EV adoption is not being able to charge at home for one reason or another. Those in that situation will be reliant on these public chargers. Of the rapid chargers in the UK, the average price is 79 pence per kilowatt hour. Assuming the same 3.5 miles per kilowatt hours of efficiency as before, that means a cost of 22.6 pence per mile. That's a whopping 10 times increase from the best case scenario of charging at home. Surely getting the price of public chargers down would be more of a priority. However, as reported so far, it sounds like the additional 3 pence per mile would be applied in this scenario too, because it's purely about vehicle mileage. So 22.6 pence per mile becomes 25.6, an increase of around 13% in this particular scenario. This is a good point to take a look at the comparative costs of electric vehicles versus petrol and diesel. Despite the huge proportional increase, charging from home is still dramatically cheaper than both petrol and diesel. The new tax only extends the misery, however, for those needing to publicly charge. I consider myself an advocate for EV adoption. I have been driving EVs for over 5 years now, and I wouldn't ever go back. But looking from a purely financial perspective at these numbers, it's difficult to recommend one if you can't charge from home. A harsh truth that really pains me to say, and this tax only makes things worse. Let's look in monetary terms at what this tax will actually cost you annually. With it being charged per mile, it's completely linear. So here's some examples based on typical driving patterns. At 5,000 miles, you would be paying an extra £150 a year. At 10,000, you would be paying an extra £300. And at 15,000 miles, you would be paying an extra £450. Remember, if you have multiple cars in your household, you need to combine the mileage of each car when calculating this. Let's think about this a little differently for a moment. What if we considered it a tax on energy rather than a tax on mileage? With electric cars being targeted specifically, perhaps it makes sense to do that. With some calculations, we can translate the proposed 3 pence per mile EV tax to the 52.95 pence fuel duty in energy terms. Let's see how things work out. The energy density of petrol and diesel is incredibly rich. For petrol, we're looking at 9.58 kilowatt hours per litre, and for diesel, it's 10.28 kilowatt hours per litre. Assuming unchanged efficiency values from what I mentioned earlier, which seem like fair real-world averages, it works out very expensive for electric vehicles, with the newly proposed EV tax being more expensive on a per kilowatt hour basis than the existing fuel duty on fossil fuels. Not by a little bit either, by nearly a factor of 2, and this is down to one thing: efficiency. With electric cars being able to convert much higher quantities of the source energy to propulsion, it makes a per mile tax system the most expensive, or from the government's point of view, most lucrative way to tax them. This has an impact across different electric vehicles too. Assuming the home charging scenario from earlier, imagine 2 different electric vehicles. One achieves 4 miles per kilowatt hour, with the other one just achieving 2 miles per kilowatt hour. Previously, the running cost would be doubled for the car, which is half as efficient. With the cost of the tax taken into account, the same efficiency difference results in a saving of only 27%. It's less severe where public charging is concerned, but efficiency becomes less of a focus, which is a bad thing when trying to promote a sustainable future. So how could this tax be applied? So far it's been reported that users would need to predict upfront their expected mileage for the upcoming year and pay in advance. That doesn't strike me as credible in the slightest for a number of reasons. To what accuracy do you know your upcoming year's annual mileage? Circumstances such as employment location or health status can change this quite dramatically. People might also intentionally try and estimate a lower value and then face years of expensive tax collection proceedings. Can it be policed? Well, ANPR cameras, they cover a lot of supermarkets these days, motorways and inner city locations. Rural areas, not so much. but I suspect it will be possible to prove when someone has given a drastically inaccurate estimate. At MOTs, mileage is recorded, but that's not applicable to cars newer than 3 years old. All in all, there seems to be a lot that doesn't stack up with how this is being reported so far. The one thing that does make sense is there might need to be some form of additional tax on EVs at some point in the future to compensate for this loss in fuel duty. The timing, however, makes absolutely no sense given the recent reintroduction of EV grants this year, albeit those target only specific makes and models under a certain price and made locally to the UK. It's far from comprehensive, those grants, but it signals support for the transition, and this seems to go against that quite strongly. Perhaps this sort of policy is being considered as a potential countermeasure for if VAT on energy bills, which is currently 5%, was to be dropped, as that would directly result in less tax revenue from electric vehicle mileage. To summarise, I'm deeply concerned about the potential of this idea. Even the suggestion of such a policy risks destabilising the electric vehicle transition at such a crucial time. It would diminish the fuel savings, particularly of the most efficient electric vehicles. It would increase the payback period when comparing electric vehicles with internal combustion engine counterparts, and it does nothing to address the huge disparity between home charging and public charging. But logic tells me this whole discussion is likely an intentional leak to gauge public opinion on the topic, as the policy doesn't seem well enough thought out to be workable. It doesn't follow the accepted accurate nature of tax, and it's too open to errors or non-compliance. Is it fair? I don't think so. There's got to be better ways of achieving fair taxation on electric vehicles. So what do you think? I'd love to hear your point of view. Could you see such a policy moving forward? If you own an electric vehicle, what are your feelings on how this will impact you? If you don't own an electric vehicle, would this put you off? And what about the wider effect on the transition to electric transportation? Is there a better way of raising funds? That's all for me today. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye bye.